First of all, I got to say, it's great to be back in Yakima. It's a special place, obviously, for us. When we moved here from Atlanta in 2016, I never thought that a small town like Yakima would have such a phenomenal effect on my life. Introduced me to the outdoor world. So, Peggy, appreciate the introduction. And in preparation to get together with you, you guys are a pretty, it's a pretty impressive group. With the things that you do and the hikes that you do, and I came across this, on your website, and I got to say that and some of my adventures have been kind of cool, but I've never run into a mushroom like this. So I'm not sure who this lady is, but it's really very impressive. But again, thanks a lot for having me. Really thrilled to be here. So let me ask, I'm going to go with two questions to start off today and a couple things for you to think about. And the first is this, have you ever run into a situation where you thought you were facing death? So maybe it was a car accident, or maybe it was a health scare, like a heart attack, but you felt as though you were facing your last few minutes on earth. The other question is this, do you dream of doing something spectacular, something phenomenal? You've got it on your agenda to do, you've got the time, you've got the money, but you keep pushing it off down the road. So I'd like you to think about those two things as I go forward. On June 30th, 2022, I dropped 60 feet into an underground ice moat. When I fell in there, when I got to the bottom, it was completely black. Next to me was a raging waterfall, the Spalding Falls on the Grand Teton. In a glimmer of light, I could see the water shimmering a little bit. Behind me was an ice wall. To the left of me was an ice wall, and in front of me was a sheer rock wall. And as I put my hands on the rock wall in front of me, realized there was nothing to grab onto, followed it all the way up, and all I could see was a tiny glimmer of light at the top. And it was at that moment that I thought to myself that those were my last couple minutes on earth. So let me tell you how I got there. In 2009, my family and I, as Peggy has mentioned, we're living in Yakima. And I was rapidly approaching my 50th birthday. And as I approached my birthday, I started to think to myself, I need to do something big for my 50th birthday. I didn't want another party. I'd had enough parties in my time, and wanted to have two criteria in what I wanted to do. The first one was to do something spectacular, something phenomenal that would really stand out to celebrate the event. The other thing was to do something that would force me to get into great physical condition. So I started thinking about that and mulling it over. And as a lot of you, I've on a drive over to Seattle from Yakima, Mount Rainier was standing out in all its glory. And I looked at Mount Rainier and I said, what if I could climb Mount Rainier to celebrate my birthday? Well, you got to understand that this is kind of an interesting thing for me to think about. I was a Philadelphia city slicker. Grew up in the city. Quite frankly, I was a Boy Scout dropout. Had never climbed anything in my life other than the stairs in my house. So to start thinking about that was a little bizarre. And so after I started thinking about it, I thought, well, I probably should go talk to somebody to see how this is done. And so I went and talked to a guy in our office at Treetop, who I was working for at the time. And went and talked to this guy. His name was Pete Shepard. And I went and talked to Pete and said, here's what I'm thinking of doing. And his first response was, well, Dan, it's very doable. He said, but it will be the most difficult thing that you've ever done in your life. Now, as everybody knows, Mount Rainier is 14,400 feet, the most glaciated peak in the continental U.S. It's considered by volcanologists to be one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world. So when Pete told me that, I said, bingo, Mount Rainier is what it is. So he set me on a training regimen and actually out at Cott's Peak. But from there, a year later in July of 2010, Pete Shepard and I were on our way to the top of Mount Rainier. And this picture is taken as you come over, for those that have been up there, it's coming over Cathedral Gap. And in the background there is the Ingraham Glacier, where we would sleep the night before we would attempt the summit. And as a guy from Philadelphia coming over this ridge, this view just completely blew me away. So after 9 months of aggressive training, losing about 30 pounds, getting in the best shape I had been in since in college, Pete Shepard and I summited Mount Rainier. And I would say in an interview with Backpacker magazine that with the exception of the marriage to my wife or the birth of my children, summiting Mount Rainier was the most spectacular thing I had done at that point. And it would put me on a mountaineering journey that would affect me mentally, physically, and spiritually. From there, I would run into, as I said, run into Dave Studhoff across the street, and he was a member of Foursquare Mountaineering. So got involved in the climbing club, and on the weekends, we would go climb a variety of peaks around the Pacific Northwest, go on some significant hikes. So we climbed Mount Adams, we climbed Mount Hood, went up Mount St. Helens, would do another climb up Mount Rainier. In addition to that, I would get down to the state of California and get down with my daughter Caroline, who was always up for an adventure with me, and we would summit Mount Whitney, tallest peak in the continental United States, 14,500 feet. Here we are on the top of Mount Rainier, our second time with Foursquare Mountaineering, and you see one of the guys in the pictures here. For my 60th birthday, we'd take it a little further and would go overseas and climb Mount Kilimanjaro, 19,400 feet, located on the African continent. Tallest peak in Africa, tallest freestanding mountain in the world, and as a lot of you know, you guys are climbers, one of the 7 summits. And we'd do that also with my daughter Caroline, and I know just from looking at some of Peggy's pictures that doing these types of climbs with anyone in your family, let alone one of your children, is really just a phenomenal event. So now let's fast forward a little bit and go to 2022. And during a ski get-together, with Jim and myself and a guy named Mark McGuire that lives in Bozeman, Montana now, we started talking about climbing the Grand Teton. So we put our plans together, and in June of 2022, we were going to climb the Grand. Now, you need to realize, what's involved in climbing it for those that aren't familiar. And climbing the Grand Teton is kind of a cool thing, but it's no easy task. And so what you usually do is climb up to that U-shaped area to the left of that peak that's called the Lower Saddle. And that entails going up, it's about a 5,000-foot vertical hike, up about 5 miles, so pretty aggressive hike. And then what most people do will sleep there, and then go for the summit the next day. Then you go up the vertical incline there, which is about a 2,000-foot gain over 2 miles. So it's a very technical climb going up there, but seemed like a pretty cool thing to do. So we went off, and just to give you an idea, so this is the way the trail starts out. It's kind of a nice little trail, kind of happy going, lots of flowers. This is going to be pretty cool. And then you go through this boulder field, and this is what you see after you got it there, and that's when it starts to get pretty serious. So we climbed up, and we got up to the Lower Saddle like everybody does. Started setting up our tents, had a little dinner, and then we talked amongst each other and said, okay, well, tomorrow morning we're going to wake up at 4 o'clock, and we're going to go for the summit. So that's what we did. We looked at the weather. The weather looked okay, and went to bed that night thinking this is going to be a lot of fun, like all of our climbs. Well, as what happens in the wilderness, the weather dramatically changed that night. And instead of it being a calm night, the winds gradually increased to the point where they would be at 40 miles an hour to 45 miles per hour sustained. And in our little 3-season tents, I was in a tent by myself, the winds were blowing so strong that night that as I lay there, the little tent stays, those little cords that connect your tent to the ground, started to pop one by one. So in the middle of the night in the dark, with a screaming wind, would go out on my hands and knees for fear that if I stood up, I'd blow down the hill and down the mountain. Would go out during the night and retie all of them. The winds when it would gust, it would get so severe that the sides of the tent would start to bow in. So it was starting to get pretty serious. So I had to sit up in my tent with my butt on the ground, lean against the windward side for fear that the side was going to blow in. The winds would get so bad that even while I was sitting there, when they would gust, they would bend me over. So it was kind of a nasty night. So when two of our climbing partners, Mark McGuire and his son Nicholas McGuire, came by my tent at 4 o'clock in the morning after a sleepless night, not wanting to be a liability to them, and also not wanting to be half asleep while I was on the most technical climb of my life, told them to go ahead. And so off they went. I went back to sleep. Woke up a couple hours later, went down this little hill to Jim's tent, and Jim had decided not to go as well. And so the two of us were kind of talking there for a little bit. We got a little bit of breakfast. The night before, as I'm sure a lot of you, anytime you're staying out in the wilderness overnight, you usually come up with plan A, plan B, plan C. And so what we had talked about was if people went and it wasn't all four of us, whoever went would go up to the mountain, and if they were close to the top, would drop a text to us to let us know how things were going. And then we could decide whether to stay at the campsite or head back down to the trailhead and then meet up with them later on. So after a little while, we got the text from Mark McGuire saying it was still pretty windy on the mountain and that we probably should head down. And so there Jim and I started to pack up everything, including one of the climbing ropes that we had. Now, you need to understand, if anybody's done any technical climbing, because there was four of us, we were going to need two climbing ropes in order to make it to the top, with somebody being on belay and somebody being able to climb up. And now, because there was only two, Nicholas and Mark had left one of the ropes behind that we had also talked about the night before. And so it was determined that if they left the rope, then somebody should carry it down for them to relieve them after they had a busy time. So there's that rope sitting there. And if you've ever backpacked, obviously, those ropes are 10 pounds, a little over 9 pounds. So you're adding 9 pounds on the way down. I'm looking at the rope. Jim's looking at the rope. And nobody's really saying a whole lot at that point. And Jim, the nicest guy that I know, said, "I'll carry the rope." And I said to him, "That sounds like a great idea." So Jim put the rope in his pack, and then we started packing up. And while we finished packing up, at that time there was a park ranger, a guy by the name of Noah, that was walking by, and he was on patrol going to the top of the Grand. Came by and talked to us and asking us what we were doing, and we said we were headed down. Our buddies went up, told him about the winds. He goes, "Yeah, I heard about the winds," and he said, "Are you guys planning on glissading?" We said, "Well, I'm not really sure." At that point, we hadn't really talked about it. And for those that have never glissaded, it's a phenomenal way to descend a mountain. Easier on your knees, a whole lot more fun. You sit on your butt, you slide down, you have an ice axe on the side to control your speed, and away you go, just laughing. Well, he said we might be glissading. So, what he told us at that time, he said, "Well, if you're planning on glissading," he said, "make sure you control your speed, and make sure you can see where you're going." Well, at this point, Jim and I, we'd been climbing for a little over 10 years. Pretty smart guys. We kind of had a handle on this. And so while we were polite to the ranger, in the back of our minds, we're thinking, we got this. But thanks a lot. So off he goes. So then there goes Jim and I. We packed up, and instead of going down, it's a steep head wall, we went down this chute from the lower saddle, it's about a 400 foot long chute that's down. It's about this wide, about a 45-degree angle, so pretty steep. So we had crampons on, we had ice axes, doing all the right things. Made our way down to the bottom of the chute, made a hard left, and went over to where the trail would take us back to the car, back to the trailhead. And at this point, we're at probably about 11,000 feet. But when we got to the back side of this hill, the side of the hill here, the wind just died. So when we got over to the boot trail, the temperature increased by like 10 degrees. So we took off some of our outer shells, we took off our crampons, took our ice axes, connected them to our packs, grabbed our poles, and then we were going to hike down using our hiking poles. Off we go. About 100 yards down, I look over and there's this gaping snowfield to our right. that was just screaming our names. And I mentioned to Jim, Jim was in front of me, and I said, we should really be glissading. And Jim was like, yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing. So we walked right out to this big snow field. We got ready to glissade and kind of determined that, we'll do this in 2 spots. We were going to stop in one spot. Jim went down first to do proper glissading, gave me the sign that was okay, and then off I went. We met down on this little flat part. The skies were as blue as you see there. It was a spectacular day. Snow was soft. Sun was out. You got 2 guys out in the wilderness doing the thing that they love to do, and we were so happy we were laughing. So then we determined that we would get down to this little rock outcropping, which was maybe about 100 yards down further. And identified that. Jim was going to get down. Same thing. So off he goes. So I see him go down. I see him go onto this rock outcropping. See him take off his pack. Takes a few steps. And then he gave me what I thought was the go sign. So off I went. I got about halfway to Jim and realized that this was steeper than the hillside that we went down before. Rapidly picked up speed to the point where about 3/4 of the way to him, I was out of control. So here comes Jim's coming at me faster and faster. And as he's coming at me, he's standing next to these 2 big rocks. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to slide down here. I'm not going to stop before I get to him, but I'm going to hit these rocks and stop. But this is really going to hurt. Well, that didn't happen. And instead of hitting the rocks, when I got there closer, there was a path in between them. Went through the rocks, went past Jim, and as I passed him, realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Went past Jim, in the air, down, and into a hole in the ice below next to the Spalding Falls. As I was falling, it's like falling in a dream where you really don't know where you're going to land. Got knocked unconscious, got the wind knocked out of me, and when I finally landed, was on a ledge, an ice ledge, about 3 feet wide, about 10 feet long, and it was dark. A dark, black abyss with a small glimmer of light coming down next to a raging waterfall that was so loud it was deafening. Behind me was an ice wall. To the left of me was an ice wall. In front of me was this rock wall, and the rock wall was wet just because of all the water coming off that waterfall. And at this point, the spray is coming on top of me. And in the back of my mind, heard something and said, remain calm, breathe easy. Knowing that from rescue training that the worst you could do at that point is to panic. So trying to remain calm. And right after that, I heard a voice that said, today is not your day to die. And while it was comforting, quite frankly, I was having a hard time believing it from where I stood. Felt the wall in front of me again and started thinking, I'm really in a lot of trouble. So let's go on top with Jim. And so Jim's up there. You got to think about what he's gone through. He's out there with his buddy. We're having a great time, beautiful day. Sees me glissading toward him. Next thing he knows, he sees me buzz by him, go over the cliff, in the air, scream out, and disappear in the hole below him, next to the raging waterfall. Jim would say in a Backpacker magazine article that at that time he started to think to himself, life is going to dramatically change. I just watched my buddy die before my very eyes. And so as he's kind of wandering around there trying to think of what he's going to do, all of a sudden he hears me call out his name, because I had started to call him out while I was down at the bottom, not knowing if he could hear me or not. So he hears my name, and at first he's like, this is great. And then, being a physician and an experienced climber, thought to himself, no, this isn't good at all. So now I'm going to have to listen to my buddy call my name as he dies a slow death of hypothermia. So Jim did what any logical person would do. He looks at his phone, figures he's got to call 911. But he has no cell service. So at that point, in a panicked plea in the wilderness, Jim screams out and said, God, I need you now. And at that point, the word rope comes to his mind. And suddenly he remembered that he had agreed to carry that 9-pound rope in his pack. Scrambles back to his pack, digs through there, pulls it out, starts throwing it into the hole where he saw me go in. Not sure how far I was, not sure if I was injured. He couldn't see me at all. But he's throwing this rope in, but the power from that waterfall was so strong that it kept blowing the rope back out. And so now he came up with the idea that, okay, if I put it over here a little bit further and feed it down like a fishing line, maybe that'll work. So he's lowering it down a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. Down below, things are getting worse. I'm getting wetter and wetter to the point where now I'm soaked from a glacial-fed waterfall that's next to me. My hands are so cold that I'm putting them in my mouth, left and right, thinking to myself, if I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to need my hands. It got gradually colder to the point where now I'm shivering uncontrollably, standing on the ledge, staring at that rock wall. And that's when I started to think to myself, this is where I'm going to die. And right about the point that I gave up hope, in the darkness, felt a tap on my shoulder. Reached my left hand around to my right shoulder because I was afraid to move too much because I was on this ice ledge, and realized it was a rope. Pulled on the rope a couple times. Whoever was on the other end gave me a little bit of slack. So I pulled it down, released my backpack, tied it around my waist, grabbed onto the rope, leaned back, pulled it once, waited for the pull to come. It never came. So I'm standing there thinking to myself, okay, now I gotta do something on my own here. So I leaned back. It was roped around my waist, like I said, looped it a little bit around my hands, my left and then my right, leaned back and then started climbing up a little bit. And what I noticed is as I was climbing and the slack came on, that it was being held taut. So I could climb up a little bit on the wall. It was like a reverse rappel is the best way to describe it. When I got about halfway, the ice wall behind me got a little closer to the rock wall in front of me. So now I could put my shoulder against the ice behind me. I could still have my legs straight out in front of me. So now I could kind of wedge my way up. Up I went to that opening, stick my head out, and there's Jim, sitting there by himself. His knees are up into his chest. His heels are dug into the side of that hill. And the first thing he says, I'll never forget it in my life, Dan, it's so good to see your face. I said, yeah, it's great to see you too. So climbed up a little bit higher, and as I got right to him, kind of said to him, I said, so where should I go? He said, well, just jump on top of me. So I jumped on top of him. Jim would say in that same magazine article that when he saw me, my skin was as white as a sheet. When I got on top of him, my temperature was as cold as ice. From the time I went into the hole to the time I got to Jim was about 45 minutes. So that's when he informed me that he didn't have any cell service. So he put his coat on me. Then he told me that he was going to go a little higher, see if he could get some cell service up there, tied me off to a rock. And as he was gone higher, he had a rescue whistle, the whistle that you always wonder why you carry. This is the reason why. And then was yelling for help. And after a while, I heard him talking to somebody. By chance, there was a park ranger walking by. At this point, we were down in a little bit of a canyon, so the trail was about 100 feet above us. This ranger had made his way down to Jim. I could hear him talking behind me, and all I could hear was Jim saying, you know, my buddy's down there. He went into that ice moat. He's injured. I thought he was dead. So the ranger makes his way down to me, does kind of a field evaluation to see how I'm doing. You know, asked me a bunch of questions and told him at that time I'd been knocked out. And that at the time I was on blood thinners as well. And so he said, well, you know, that's not very good. So I'm going to call for a helicopter rescue. So this is my ride down that day. Compliments of the Park Service. And so this is called a short haul rescue, designed to rescue mountaineers from the side of a mountain when the helicopter can't land. And so what they do is they lower that basket down. By this point, there was a bunch of other rangers that had come on the scene. They put me in the basket, and were going to run me down the valley. But while we were waiting, it took about 45 minutes for the helicopter to get there because he was fighting a fire. And while I'm lying there, I'm talking to this park ranger that had come up. And all of a sudden I'm looking at him, I'm thinking, man, this guy looks really familiar. And suddenly I asked him the question. I said, you're the same ranger that we saw earlier today, aren't you? And he goes, yeah, I am. And so all you could do at that point is, I guess you're going to scold me now about proper glissading techniques. And he goes, no. He said, there's no judgment here. He said, I'm just glad you're alive. He said, you're very lucky. And so they put me in the basket. We go down the valley. And as you can see, there's a ranger that's strapped to the side of that basket, which is actually pretty cool. So he's strapped to the side. His head's about right here. And so we could actually talk while we're going down the valley there. And he's monitoring my conditions and all of that. And while he's talking to me, he goes, I understand that you climbed out while your buddy pulled up the slack to get out of that ice mode. I go, yeah, I did. He said, man, you're pretty lucky. I'm like, yeah, I think so. So we get down to the valley, down to the Lupin Meadows at the trailhead where there's a stretcher there, a bunch of other park rangers. They put me on the stretcher, put me in an ambulance, and off we go to the Jackson Memorial Hospital. And in that ambulance is a rescue EMT that doubles as a ranger, a guy by the name of John Politis. And John's talking to me too, trying to keep me calm, so he's kind of gone through the same thing the other guys were, and he goes, understand that you climbed out of there while your buddy pulled up the slack on that rope. I said, yeah. He goes, man, you're pretty lucky. And at this time, I'd heard it 3 times. I'm like, yeah, I think I'm pretty lucky. And he could tell I was making light of the moment. And he got a little stir and points at me and he said, no, you don't understand. He said, over the past 4 years, 3 other climbers have gone into that mode about where you did. He said, you're the first rescue. All 3 of the others were body recoveries. Nothing drives home being human more than knowing you just escaped death, but faced it at the same time. So started thinking about that moment and started to think about my journey. I started to think about it. Obviously had a pretty big impact on my life. And so as a result, I started to think, so what have the mountains taught me? Now, if you talk to my wife, the mountains have taught me that I don't need to be in the mountains. But I share with you a few things today. And being outdoor people like yourself, I just ask you to think about them and take it to heart. But here's a few things that I've thought about. And the first is staying on guard. You know, this quote by Reinhold Messner, probably the best climber ever. And basically what it says is the wilderness is impersonal. Doesn't care if you're a nice person, bad person, you've worked out, you've done all the right things, things happen. And so what I say to you while you're out there you're hiking and doing all your things to just stay on guard. Be aware, try and do the right things all the time. But I would also tell you this as far as staying on guard, as we age. Stay active. Do what you guys are doing all the time. Ward off the old man that's staring us down all the time and stay active and keep moving. The other I would say is enjoy the journey. Louis L'Amour has this quote and I just love it. And here's the reason why. Is when I first started climbing with all these guys, I was always a sales guy at heart. So goals were really, very important. So the whole thing was to get to the top, we'd take a few pictures and laugh. And then on the way down, we'd start talking about what we were going to do next, our next climb. Well, I don't do that anymore. And I actually take the notes from Dave Studhoff here, who always, when we were climbing, would always want to stop and take pictures. Dave was always taking pictures of the flowers or the animals and all these kinds of things. And some of us gave him grief about it. But Dave lived the right way, paying attention to what's going on. And if you think about it, life isn't meant to be a journey to the grave. The idea is to kind of pay attention to what's going on. Take it all in. Pay attention to what goes on. This is a flower that I would have never noticed before. It was on the ground on a hike in North Georgia. I'd also say this is, went back to the Grand Teton, or went back to the Tetons this summer. This is the sunset at the Lower Saddle. Something I never did before, but I've got a lot of sunset pictures now. I also take pictures of mushrooms. It's not as impressive as your mushrooms, but they're there on the ground. And again, they're on the ground. I would have never noticed them before. The other I would say is miracles happen. The smartest man in the world that's ever lived made this quote. And I think that you ought to think about it hard. On June 30th, 2022, I believe I experienced a God-given miracle. And here's the reason why I tell you that. The fact that Jim volunteered to carry that rope that day. If I would have carried it, it would be at the bottom there, and I'd be there too, dead. The fact that the rope went into the right place, hit me in the shoulder in the dark. Jim didn't know where I was. I couldn't talk to him because of how loud that waterfall was. Ended up tapping me on the shoulder and being able to get out. The fact that that rope was long enough to get me out of there and that I hadn't fallen any further. In doing some research after falling there, you get a little inquisitive, and so I started to look up one of the people that had died a few years before, and the reason why he died is while he was down there, they tried to lower a rope to him. The rope was too short. So by the time they went to get the other rope that was long enough and got it down there to him, he had already died. The fact that my injuries weren't any worse than what they were. After I got to the hospital, I would find out that I had actually broken my leg. My lower leg snapped completely through. Had some ligament damage to my knee. Had some pretty severe bruising down my left side. But if I would have broken my arms, would have broken my hand, my shoulders, would have been knocked unconscious, would have never been able to climb out of there like I did. The fact that that park ranger, Noah, was walking by right at the right time while Jim's blowing his rescue whistle and screaming for help. It was probably mid-afternoon by that time, by the time Jim was calling for help. And at that time, it's considered, even in June, is considered early season in the Tetons on the trail there. So people are either at the lower saddle by mid-afternoon or they're back at the trailhead. So the fact that he was in the middle there was pretty remarkable. If he hadn't have gotten to us, we probably would have had to spend the night out there that night. I was shivering uncontrollably, on the verge of hypothermia. Obviously, Jim had given me some of his clothes to keep warm as well. So the both of us would have ended up spending the night on the side of that hill on the rocky slope overnight, and who knows what would have happened. So I say to you, while you're out, in the wilderness and looking around, if something doesn't seem like it adds up, maybe it's a miracle, and maybe you chalk it up to that. Gratitude. You'll never meet anybody more grateful than me. And here's what I'm most grateful for. And John Muir, obviously the most quotable climber or outdoors person ever. But, John Muir sets it in the right perspective, I think. And by being in the wilderness, I think we would all agree that we get more back than what we put in. But I do think that gratitude and just being a grateful person as a result of this has made me a better person. One of the best things that's happened in my life is my accident. It's given me a different perspective on life, a greater appreciation for life, and really thrilled to enjoy every day. The other thing I'm grateful for is the recruiter that called me and said, I've got a job for you in Yakima, Washington, living in Atlanta. And I said, well, I could be there Monday, but first I need to find out where it is. Moving to Yakima changed my life for the better, changed our family's life for the better. And so I'm grateful for that as well. Also grateful for a few other things. Obviously, these guys. Foursquare Mountaineering, it's the climbing group that I got involved with. There's three of the guys here. But this was the core group, and these were the guys that we used to climb with all the time. And so grateful for these guys. People say about friends for life, these are friends for life. I could text any of these guys at any time, and if we haven't talked for a year or two, send them a text, and it's like we're back there again. We would go on a lot of trips. We've never been lost. We've just been misdirected a little bit, right, Dave?
Route finding.
Route finding. So it's just route finding. But all those were phenomenal adventures and laughed harder than anybody, and the experiences we've had, I'm so grateful for. I'm grateful for these guys. So when I went back to the Tetons this summer, these are the Rangers. The guy on the left is Noah. The guy on the center is John Politis. Ran into him on the trail by chance on the way down, which is a pretty remarkable thing. The guy on the right is a guy by the name of Ryan Schuster. And Ryan ran the command center during our rescue. And what we would find out is that there are almost 20 Rangers that were involved in getting Jim and I off the mountain that day. And Ryan is the one that kind of led the whole team. So grateful for these guys. And obviously I'm grateful for this guy. For Jim Zingerman. People say that you have your friends, and some of your friends will say they've got your back, but I know that Jim would risk his life for me because he did. If he hadn't have thrown that rope down, if he would have thought to himself, I'm going to try and get a hold of rescue and not do anything about it, probably would have died that day. So always grateful for Jim, and he usually drinks free scotch from me as much as I can. What I'd like to close with is this, what if versus not anymore. And I'd say for you to live a life of what ifs. And as you look around, that list of things that you've been thinking about. And I say live a life of what if as compared to saying, I don't do that anymore. On your table there, I've got some cards. And what I'd like you to do is look at them, take them home, list your lists of what ifs, things that you've been putting off, things that you've thought about doing, and think about a way that you're going to get it done. So this quote by T.S. Eliot is very telling, and something that you need to think about while you're out there in the wilderness is that you don't know how far you can go until you push a little bit. The Navy SEALs have done studies, and they say that when you think you've hit your max capacity on a physical endeavor for the first time, you're only at 40% of your capacity. So imagine if you could get to 50 or 55%, how spectacular life would be. So I'd say look at your what ifs. Think about them, challenge yourself, and figure about a way about how you're going to get it done. So let me tell you about a what if climb that I did this past September. Back to the Grand Teton, where I almost died. I went back up, here's on the way there. And in September of this year, summited the enclosure on the Grand Teton, which is a pretty remarkable time. So I challenge you to think about that portion of the PCT that you've been eyeing and thinking about doing. I challenge you to go over and do the Camino Trail that you've thought about doing. I challenge you to go to Cott's Peak if you've never been up there before. Figure out what your what ifs are and figure out a way to get them done. Imagine how fulfilling your life would be if you acted on your what ifs. If this Boy Scout dropout, this city slicker from Philadelphia, can climb the tallest peaks in the Pacific Northwest and on the African continent, imagine how enriched your life would be if you went through with your what ifs. I'm Dan Waker. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks a lot. So thrilled to be here. Told Peggy wanted to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions, comments, or any thoughts or whatever, here to talk. Yeah.
Did you go back for your pack?
Well, it's a good story. Actually, I did not go back, but I called the park ranger because I also lost my phone when I was up there. But my pocket got ripped off, and so I actually wanted my phone back. So I called them about my phone, and they said, no, your phone's kind of, I don't think that's going to work out. He said, but when all that ice and snow melts, he said, your pack is going to be sitting in the middle of the trail. He said, so we'll keep an eye out for it. So I'm like, okay, yeah, sure. 2 months later, I got a call from the Park Service. Said they found my pack with all my things in it. They took everything out of my pack, laid it in the sun, dried it out, put it in a box. My accident happened in June. In October, I got this big box with everything in it. Lit my jet boil, lit my headlamp, and it was phenomenal. But the Park Service did that for me. So yeah, so got everything back and still use it today. Yeah. I keep the pack. I don't use the pack anymore. I kind of save it for a lot of reasons. Absolutely, exactly right. So yeah, anybody else? Yeah.
How long was the rope?
The rope is so it's about a 200-foot rope. So and the reason why it's that long is because usually you're doubling up doing a belay. But the rope is it's a 200-foot rope. So Jim had some wrapped around him. I had some wrapped around me. But the other guys that fell in there before fell further down. With this waterfall, with the Spalding Falls, where I entered is relatively at the top. The bottom is about 200 feet down in the valley, and that's actually what Jim was half expecting me to to come out the end not in very good shape, but the rope is about 200 feet long. Yeah.
Can you describe what rescue did in terms of dealing with your hypothermia and how they took care of you until you were lifted out?
Sure thing. With hypothermia, it sets in and it's tough to get warm to build up body temperature, especially being out there. We were fortunate that laying on the rocks, when I came out of there, I could lay on the rocks, and the rocks had been sitting out in the sun all day. So that kind of helped a little bit to get my temperature up a little bit. I was still shaking pretty uncontrollably when I was in the basket. So it was Jim's coat. They carry a sleeping bag in their pack. Noah had one in his pack, so they put the sleeping bag on top of me and then try to do as much as possible. That was pretty much it, and went down that way. It was also it was a sunny day.
Any liquids they were able to?
No liquids at that point. They gave me an IV when I got to the ambulance and started pumping me there. But their whole deal was it was more to get me down because they weren't really sure what was going on inside. But they did give me an IV when I got to the ambulance.
And did you say it was 45 minutes you were down in the hole, or between your fall and getting up above?
Yeah, 45 minutes from the time I went in to the time I got out to Jim.
And then how long till you were on Lupin Meadows?
It was probably about another, so when Noah showed up to me, he called pretty much right away. And at that point, he said it was going to be 45 minutes because they were fighting a fire in the valley. So another 45 minutes there. It's about another half hour, down the valley to get to the ambulance. So it was a little bit, but I would say that lying there in that stretcher, and for those of us that ski, we always refer to that stretcher as the sled of shame that the ski patrol brings you down in and never wanted to be in it. But that goes on the gratitude list as well. But lying in that stretcher and looking up at that sun and feeling, you don't realize how warm the sun is until you're that cold. And so all those things combined, but that was about the timing. Anybody else?
How do you fly on an airplane when you have no ID?
Again, that's a good question. When we, Jim and I got to the emergency room, and I had left my, I thought I was playing it safe. I didn't want to leave my wallet and my ID in the car, right? So I thought, this would be smart. I'll put it with me, and I'll put it in my pack. So I had my license and all my ID in my pack. That was at the bottom there. And so, we're in the hospital room, and I'm talking about I had a flight out from Salt Lake City back to Atlanta the next day. That was regularly scheduled. And I talked to my wife. Jim said, "You need to call your wife." I said, I really don't want to call my wife right now. So he insisted, being a good friend, and so we called Mary, and Mary answered the phone. I had to use Jim's phone. And I said, I had a fall, I broke my leg, but I'm going to be home tomorrow and it'll all be good. And she goes, "Oh, okay, that's okay." Hang up the phone, and then a few minutes later, she had talked to our son because he was down visiting from Seattle at our place in outside of Atlanta, and she sent a note to Tim, or sent a text to Jim saying, if you broke your leg, how did you end up hiking down? And Jim, at this point, sends a text to her saying, "Dangling from underneath a helicopter." So needless to say, Mary calls again, and she's, I had all these questions I didn't that she wanted to ask, and then mentioned to her that I didn't have any ID, and she said, how are you gonna get home? And so it was Mary's idea to send a copy of my passport to me. So the hospital was very good. They let us. She faxed a copy of my passport to them, and then was able to use that at the airport. And I wasn't really sure if it was going to work or not. And actually, Jim and I called Delta, asking them if I could use this copy, and that. It's a customer service line. I love Delta. I live in Atlanta, but it's a wonderful thing. But sometimes you get that person. And she said, "You're not going to be able to use that." I'm like, "Well, I don't have any idea." She goes, "You're not going to be able to fly." I'm like, "You got to be kidding me." So we got back. So anyway, make a long story short, using the copy of that passport, I got down to I drove because Jim was gone off to Coeur d'Alene with his family for the 4th of July weekend. I drove from Driggs, Idaho, down to Salt Lake City in the rental car, no license, no phone, and with a broken left leg. Fortunately, I'm a right footer. But the other part is, so this is the downside of traveling with a physician. They gave me pain pills to take for my leg, because at this point, things are starting to throb a little bit. So I was going to go get the pills, and Jim goes, "Well, you can't take those if you're going to be driving tomorrow." I'm like, "Well," so then you have knowledge, so you can't do it, right? So my leg's throbbing. We drove down to this, probably about like a 2.5-hour drive, down to Salt Lake City. Got into the airport, got a bunch of, and there's some things in the book that'll tell you about it. But everybody that was from with the exception of the lady on the phone at Delta, everyone else was just, you run into every angel around every corner, helping me out. I had 2 bags, because the week before, I was out there because of our daughter had gotten married outside of Salt Lake City the week before. And so I had everything from a tuxedo to crampons in these 2 huge bags. And I've got a broken leg and I'm on crutches, and I'm thinking, I don't know how I'm going to carry all this stuff. The rental car people carried my stuff. That guy that stands at the curb that you always hate because he's telling you to get away from the curb, grabbed all my stuff, took it into Delta. Delta called a wheelchair for me. So I was down there. I got down there a few hours ahead of time, not knowing what it was going to be. I was through security within like half an hour from the time I got to the airport. So pretty spectacular. But I did get through. They did accept my passport because it matched up with the numbers that I had in my profile as well. So that worked out okay. Yeah. So thanks for that question. Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, thank you very much. Thrilled to be here. Thrilled to be back in Yakima. Obviously, a wonderful place. Peggy, really appreciate it. Glad we ran into each other on the way to Cott's Peak. And enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you very much.